relating to the convention, the global north in the convention, and the argument around the trade agenda, which most of you will know, but it's good to have a bit of a background. Africa and the convention, what that means for African states, and of course ending with the global south and the convention, which is the reason why I'm here today with you. In 2005, UNESCO Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions, hereafter referred to as the Convention, is a landmark achievement not only because of the rate at which parties adopted and then ratified its entry into force, but because for the first time in history, culture is codified as a distinct area of international law. This paper attempts to open up the debates on what the Convention means for African states who are party to this agreement. In order to do so, it is important to note the entry point of the Convention by briefly reviewing its history and raison d'etre, and then analyzing the consensus and disagreements of foreign policy for cultural diversity. In particular, the relevance of African countries in the context of cultural rights landscape. Much has been documented about this history and the development of the Convention, which has led to the current form today. The Convention essentially arises out of the world trade negotiations of the 90s. After the collapse of the communism and of the Berlin Wall, which ushered in capitalism, the notion of free trade as the dominant way of doing business. Thus, the core issue being tackled at the time of the Convention's drafting was essentially a trade issue, in particular by northern countries in the face of progressive trade liberalization affecting all goods and services, including cultural industries. During the negotiations of the WTO on the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, as well as the General Agreement on Trade and Services, debates raged between a market-orientated view of cultural goods and services and one that acknowledged the cultural exception, which treated culture differently from commercial products. We all know this. The pro-culture argument meant that trade in cultural goods and services could not be subject to the same trade liberalization treatment and laws as commercial goods due to its dual economic and cultural nature. In particular, the view that culture acts as a vehicle for identities, values, and meanings, and is therefore a necessary part of our common humanity. This was of particular concern for Canada and European nations such as France, who felt their cultural expressions were being threatened by the cultural hegemonic dominance of the USA, perpetuated by unfettered trade flow of cultural goods and services, i.e. Hollywood movies and the likes. Thus, the following definition forms a central tenet of the Convention: being convinced that cultural activities, goods, and services have both an economic and a cultural nature because they convey identities, values, and meanings, and must therefore not be treated as solely having a commercial value. That's page 2 of the Convention. However, it is then interesting to note that against this background of largely northern debates around the culture and trade quandary, of the first 30 states to ratify the Convention in order for it to enter into force, 19 were developing states, that is 63%, of which 9 were African, which is about 30%. Thus, the indelible support of developing countries helped to secure the entry into force of the Convention in record time, much to the relief of the developed nations. The next slide is a table, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, from UNCTAD, the Creative Economy Report in 2010. I'd like to bring your attention to some of the figures below. As you can see, Africa's contribution is said to be 0.5% of the exports of creative goods in world trade. Just note, I haven't included services here, and of course, one also needs to note that this doesn't take into account the informal economy. So it must be pointed out that according to this report, developing nations' world contribution of exports of creative goods is almost on par with developed nations. You can see there 43% from developing economies versus 55.8% in developed economies. Making this convention in relation to the trade argument or question a very relevant issue for developing nations. However, this is not the case for African states, where Africa's share of world trade is still only 0.5%. How relevant is the cultural industries, and by extension the convention, to African states, one could then ask. Africa and the convention. To date, as of September 2012, this month, 124 states have signed the convention, or 125 including the EU as a regional actor. Of those, 36 out of 55 African countries have ratified the convention, with the most recent African state being Rwanda in July this year. I think it's also the most recent ratification as well. Some would intimate that this rapid uptake has less to do with the belief in the convention and more to do with aligning themselves with international norms and standards. I mean, Africa has lots of great policies. African states have signed numerous policies such as the AU Plan of Action on Creative and Cultural Industries, etc. But states lack evidence of real implementation. In fact, just yesterday, we were invited as ARTerial Network to the 4th AU Conference of Ministers of Culture at the end of October in the DRC. There's also an experts meeting, so hopefully we'll have more evidence of the implementation of all these great policies that African states have signed up to. The creative economy has been much debated internationally, with the cultural industries deemed an important growth area generally, given the importance of the rising knowledge economy and its contribution to national GDPs in the north. For the African continent, and with the fast approaching MDG's deadline in 2015, the Convention's supporters are promoting cultural industries as an expression of culture and development. Given the insignificant cultural trade statistics and the realities experienced on the ground, we have a wealth of natural and human resources. It could be argued, however, that general economic growth in Africa is not an issue here. It is in fact wealth distribution, cultural rights violations, and a host of other developmental issues. For example, South Africa is a case in point, with the largest GDP on the continent, yet suffering from one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world and growing, and still having to fight for fundamental freedoms 18 years after democracy. This year, ARTerial Network, our organization, is hosting its second African Creative Economy Conference to be held in Senegal from the 14th to the 16th of November. And we will tackle some of these very hardly debated issues in light of Africa's particular context and challenges in relation to creative industries, human rights, and equitable access to the continent's economic and cultural resources. So I invite you guys to come if you can. On the other hand, the Convention does locate itself firmly in a rights-based approach. And going back to the particularities of the Convention itself, it is easy to see why developing countries would support such a text, as there are many favorable articles, clauses, which stipulate explicit support for the development of local industries, access to global markets of the North, through a preferential treatment clause, explicit reference for the need for developing nations to take part in international cultural collaboration efforts, and access to the International Fund for Cultural Diversity. The next page just highlights some of the extracts from the Convention. And all the orange pieces are referring to specifically developing nations references. And I won't go through all of them. We can go to the next slide. Article 14. Next slide. Okay, so collaborative arrangements, preferential treatment, international cooperation. Next slide. I think that's it. Okay. However, there are many difficulties, as was pointed out by our moderator, many difficulties that can be identified at an international and national level, which prevents the Convention from achieving its goals. and this relates particularly to the South. Internationally, much has changed since the convention came into force. For instance, post-9/11 era, leading to greater security concerns in the global north and more aggressive foreign policies, the rise of mass civil society protests and revolutions across the Arab world, and of course the effects of the global economic crisis, all leading to greater nationalism, protectionism, xenophobia, distrust, and more closely guarded resources. For example, it's a greater move away from the cultural diversity language of the Convention, as stated above in Article 14 to 17. For instance, artists are continuously being denied access to global markets of the North due to xenophobia, in direct contravention of the spirit of the Convention. We have a campaign that we're busy collecting stories about these visa-denied stories. And there's one artist here from Kenya who has written, "My name is Cyrus Kabiru. I'm a visual artist based at Kuona Trust Art Studios, Nairobi, Kenya. I've been denied visa 2 times to the UK on grounds that I do not have any dependents in my country and that I'm a flight risk. My invitation to attend the TED Awards was cut short, and it is only through the intervention of my host in the UK that I managed to get another opportunity to go to the UK. I spent a lot of money on both visas, which is non-refundable. I think it's highly unfortunate that single, hard-working artists are deprived opportunity to excel due to their status. What a pity." This is compounded at a national level, of course, where the lack of vision and political will in the global South about the role of culture in development leads to general apathy when it comes to integration and implementation of many good international cultural conventions on a local level. There also tends to be a general lack of cultural champions within governments, largely due to the confusion as to the location of culture as a portfolio within government. The general distrust between government and civil society also leads to tensions in the cultural arena, and of course this is not taking into account the general conditions experienced by civil society on the ground. Lack of proper infrastructure, access to basic education, non-competitive products, poor quality, lack of startup capital, poor local markets, which makes it even more difficult for the Convention's objectives to become a reality. Just another small example, and I don't want to be the doom and gloom person, but just another small example. According to Article 9A of the Convention, it stipulates that parties shall provide appropriate information in their reports to UNESCO every 4 years on the measures taken to protect and promote the diversity of cultural expressions within their territory at an international level. 94 quadrennial reports were due on April 2012. The results of the submissions are not publicly available, but I am aware that only 3 out of the 27 African states, parties, required to submit in April 2012 have done so on time. That's Nigeria, Namibia, and Tunisia. What does this say then about our state's commitment to the rules and regulations of the Convention? Although this may paint a gloomy picture of the current state of affairs, which needs to be exposed and debated, there are some international cooperation actions which are contributing towards the proposed objectives of the Convention. However, this is largely, in our experience as ARTerial Network, mostly despite the Convention, rather than because of it. For example, ARTerial Network's attempts to forging formal North civil society to South civil society networks has led to nowhere. It appears that Northern actors are struggling to safeguard their dwindling finances and are looking after their survival, thereby trumping their obligations to the Convention. One positive change, though, that can be seen today is the rise of a new stakeholder, namely civil society, becoming more engaged and vocal on an international and national level. This rising player has an ever-important role to play in shedding light and solutions on the above challenges, and this is also explicitly mentioned in Article 11. And I'm almost finished. Financial resources. There There are some financial resources dedicated to the implementation of the Convention, namely the International Fund for Cultural Diversity, EU resources for the UNESCO Experts Facility training, which we are taking part in, investing in People's Program, etc., and other international agencies dealing in culture. However, as pointed out by many of the panelists yesterday, the total funds contributed to date, $5,402,000 or so dollars, is little more than a marketing budget of a poor Hollywood movie, according to some critics, and hardly enough to have a real impact on the ground. The uneven contributions by state parties also tell a story of the seriousness or lack thereof to the implementation of the Convention. For example, I just did a quick analysis. Maybe you can go to the next. Okay, go back. Okay, quick analysis shows me that Luxembourg, a European nation, a state party, has contributed 0 since 2006. However, it's been voted twice the European capital of culture, has a 37% immigration population, and the second highest GDP per capita in the world. Whereas Norway's contribution is almost 27% of the entire fund. Despite many state parties not fulfilling even a voluntary contribution among them, developed nations have contributed 89% of the total fund to date, with other developing nations contributing 10% and Africa a mere 0.3%. It is also interesting to note, and you can go to the next slide, yes, yeah. It is also interesting to note that African state parties are benefiting the most from the IFCD pool, with a return of investment of 4,643%. So it's just interesting, you know, if you look at the numbers and table it and just analyze it, it just gives a pretty interesting picture of what's been happening. And I'm sure we'll get a clearer picture as the years go by and when people contribute more and more to this fund. Although more international resources need to be brought to bear in order for the Convention to truly materialize, more importantly is the commitment of local resources that need to be harnessed for the effective protection and promotion of the diversity of local cultural expressions. Research by civil society needs to shed light on the financial commitments governments have made to their Convention obligations at an international, regional, and national level in order to hold them accountable to their promises. Which brings me to the South and the Convention. So, if North-South strategies are not working, perhaps there's an even greater need for the Global South to have a conversation with one another regarding regional strategies to develop regional markets, alternative debating forums, and greater leverage of trade blocs such as BRICS in order to push the Convention agenda forward. At the same time, the rising power of civil society in the Global South needs to be more closely coordinated with a greater focus on sound research, analysis, strategies to defend and promote the Convention and the principles espoused therein. It is also apparent that international civil society organizations are not sufficiently activist and generally propound the interests and perspectives of the North over the South. It is therefore up to the South to put forward their agenda and the interests in a stronger and more critical fashion. In addition, the 2010 UNCTAD Creative Economy Report notes that South-South trade of creative goods has tripled in the last 6 years, suggesting that perhaps this is indeed a new growth area to be enhanced and explored. To end, it is important to highlight that the Convention is not a host of elite projects enshrined in UNESCO speak. It is important to bring the Convention principles and objectives to the citizen level. The idea is to harness the rising power of civil society to work towards a healthy society. The Convention is not the objective, but one of the means to create the society that we want for our future. Thank you very much.